Thanks for joining us. You have wandered into a session entitled, I am a learning engineer and so can you. Grammatically, it should say, and so can you be, but it was a play on words from Stephen Colbert's groundbreaking child novel entitled, I am a Pole and so can you. So it's a reference to that. Thank you for joining us. I'm just gonna walk through real quickly our session objectives, introduce ourselves, and we've lost a little bit of time. We know that the keynote went on a little longer, and so we'll make up some time. We're hoping this is actually gonna be a bit of an interactive session where we'll develop a basic understanding of learning engineering and learning science and how it applies, understand some key insights, and then build some design muscle in applying those insights. I come from the perspective of being the co-founder of Transcend Education and have worked in the school model design world for a while now. And what we do is provide R&D capacity to school partners to build new models. And I'm joined by my colleague, Bror.
And I'm Bror Saxberg. I am currently the Chief Learning Officer at Kaplan, Inc., which is a large, multifaceted education company. And what we've been doing over the last 6, 7, 8 years now is transforming it into a learning engineering organization, meaning that all 20 plus of the different learning business units inside Kaplan are actually taking learning science quite seriously, as well as measurement, good learning measurement, and are trying to change the way in which they think about new products and improving old products. And so I've got some pretty good hands-on experience. There are even some colleagues in the room who've been working with me on this about how to do this at scale and practically as well. So that's what I bring.
Fantastic. And we're joined by two partners at Transcend, Rob Strain and Jenee Henry Wood, who particularly in our small group sessions are going to help get through the task at hand. All right, so let's dive in. Just to set the stage a little bit on thinking about school design and what we call the case for change. I know I might be preaching to the choir a bit, but our own particular spin on this is that if we continue to do school the way we do it now, we'll follow the probable curve, and we'll get to a certain set of likely outcomes. That trajectory may stay flat, it may go up a little bit, but certainly we have deep conviction around the idea that unless we change the trajectory entirely, until we think about what is possible, there's no way that we'll ever see something this steep. That's going to get to a set of desired outcomes that I think we're learning are important for every family and child and for society at large, right? So I don't need to go into the whole pitch here about the factory model, et cetera, but we're very much oriented here. The goal of this work is to get to a place where we can get vastly better outcomes with vastly more kids across even more outcomes than we measure today. The way that we want to get to the possible and some of the inputs that we look at to try to get to that trajectory, they really fall into 3 buckets. One is our aspirations of students. We're not going to spend a ton of time on that today, but I want to just do a quick shout out for the idea of making sure that we're talking to students and parents about what they really want. And not just hearing what they say, but following their actions, being anthropologists, understanding the way they live, understanding what they most need, even if they themselves aren't able to articulate it. And by the way, when you ask them, they can articulate a whole lot, right? And so this isn't just, for us, it's not just a part or a step in the design process, it's actually an orientation that is part of the entire evolution of the way we do design and then evolve models ongoing. That students and parents are at the center and very much a part of the conversation, not on the outskirts looking in. Number 2 are the demands of the future. So I'm sure there have been plenty of sessions you've attended, where we talk about how the economy is changing and the needs of, globalization and, what's happening with the environment and technology and artificial intelligence, et cetera. I mean, the list goes on of the skills and knowledge that students are going to need in order to be successful in this world and be happy in this world. And we can't pretend to know exactly what 30 years what 30 years from now will look like, but we do heed Wayne Gretzky's advice to not skate to where the puck is, but where the puck is going. And so we try to approximate the best we can, that sort of disposition. And then finally, and this is the place where we're going to spend the most time, is learning science. As we know, there are insights and research that tell us about how the brain works, how people are motivated, how they establish identity and a sense of belonging. And we're trying to get that knowledge that sometimes is academic and make sure that it is expressing itself in real prototypes and experiences that students have every day in school and elsewhere. So I'm going to skip that for now just to cut some time. So our core beliefs about learning. When we think about what those are, we try to ground them in learning science. There are three big ways that we do that. We're going to start with cognition. And just to frame it up, we're asking ourselves, how will our learners build and apply knowledge and skills in deep and enduring ways? And what do we know about brain science that helps us answer that question and build prototypes that answer that question? Number two, how will our learners develop deep understanding of themselves, their passions, and values? Increasingly, the science is telling us this is important, and we're going to dive into that a little bit. And then we're going to spend the most time is on motivation. What would it take for our students to be wildly motivated to learn? So let's start with cognition, and Bror, maybe you can drop some knowledge on us.
So I'm going to give you like a 3-minute master's degree in cognitive science. There will be a quiz at the end. No, there won't be a quiz. But basically, the point here is there's been like 40 years of work on understanding how does expertise work? How do minds actually learn? And almost none of this has found its way into education at scale, whether it's education schools or publishing houses or even this conference. You're going to find not a lot of mention. It's a somewhat learning science-free zone, unfortunately. And that makes it a little tricky to understand how all of this great tech is supposed to help students. It's a bit like spraying chemicals on sick people and wondering why it's not working. Do you like that idea? So we're not in favor of spraying chemicals on sick people and wondering why it's not working. We're more in favor of understanding the mechanisms of learning and then figuring out how do we use all kinds of things, people and family and technology, to intervene. So fundamental things that have come out of a lot of work over the last 40 years is a model of how expertise and learning really function that's really valuable to internalize. So you start with stimuli that come in from the outside. Let's assume we're talking only about audio and visual, although in fact it could be any stimuli, but the whole business of physicians licking their patients is long out of fashion. So, we don't have to worry about that anymore. So you think about audio and visual stimuli coming in. They first stop in working memory. So working memory has a set of characteristics. It is where your verbal you lives. So the talky part of your mind. So if I start talking in a high squeaky voice, and you're thinking, this is a very strange character up front, you are right. But that monologue inside your head is happening in working memory. That's where your words and your person lives when it's talking to you, in a sense. It also turns out to be very slow. It's very flexible, so it's where all the hard stuff, the new stuff, and therefore a lot of learning stuff has to come first. It's error-prone, unfortunately, and it just can't hold very many things at once. So if all we had to deal with the difficulties of the world was our working memory, we would be in a real bad place because of all those problems with it. We'd have this flexible system, but we'd keep losing things off the edges. The good news for human minds is that it's supported in a kind of an infinite bandwidth way by long-term memory that has completely different characteristics. It is very fast. It can run many complex procedures in parallel. It will retain things, as the name suggests, for a long time. It's very accurate if it's been trained to be accurate. I mean, you have to train it to get it to work this way. And really, unfortunately, it does not have words, which means it turns out research on experts shows that something like 70% of what experts actually decide and do is no longer accessible in words to them. So the simple example of this is when I was sent out, a decade ago to teach my eldest son to ride a bicycle. My wife kicks me out. I've got a bike. I got the 6-year-old boy. I'm at the top of a hill. I'm looking at the bike. I'm looking at the boy. I'm an educated guy. What do you say? So I look at him and I say, well, you get on the bike and you ride it. And as he's done his entire life, and he still does, he looks at me with that "you are an idiot" look. And I realize this is not sufficient to the task. And I'm just staring at the bike, and it's like, what? So I had to get on the bike. And as I get on the bike, my foot kicks the pedal up, and I'm thinking, well, hey, that's kind of interesting. Oh, yeah, if I don't kick the pedal up, I can't push it down. So I had to narrate my own expertise. I retrieved the words in working memory through performance. I mean, it was a really weird experience. It's not that I didn't know how to ride a bike. I've been riding bikes for 30 years by that time, right? It was the words were actually lost. Here's another example. Raise your hand if you drive a car. Okay, that's great. I tried this in Singapore. It was a disaster. Okay, so here's the question for you. Raise your hand if the following has happened to you. You set out for place A, and then you start thinking about work and life and ASU GSV, and you look up, and you're at place B instead. Raise your hand if that's ever happened to you. Raise your hand, see, look around, you're not crazy, not for that reason. Okay, good. So, I just laugh, I'm so old, I just think I put in the wrong program card. Remember Hollerith cards, punching the hanging chads? Never mind, anyway. And, I move on, right? But actually take a moment, Who drove you to the wrong place? Right? Who was in charge of a ton of metal going at 10, 20, 50 miles an hour for 5, 10, 20 minutes at a time? Because it wasn't you. You were thinking about something completely different. And cognitive scientists have found all kinds of expertise works this way. So remember, driving is complex, right? This is not like breathing or digesting your bagel, which you also don't have to think about. It just sort of happens, thank heavens, away from your conscious thinking. This is a complex activity involving rules and planning and judgment of other people's intentions and navigation, all kinds of stuff, right? This is not a simple thing, and yet it's completely automated, right? And you can think about something else. Now, lots of experts have these pools of complex cognitive procedures that they can actually run automatically, but it's important to realize the purpose of learning on the cognitive dimension is not to have everything be automated. Some things are always going to be rich collaborations between working memory and long-term memory. So you can plan your summer vacation while driving to work. No problem. You cannot write a persuasive essay and plan your summer vacation at the same time. You just can't. Because writing a persuasive essay always involves hard problem solving around your audience and your message and the tone and all this that you just can't automate all the way away. So the purpose, in a sense, of building expertise is to get the right things into long-term memory, meaning that they really become mastered in that way that makes them be simple for you, seeming simple to you, and also build the practice of using it with working memory where that's the right thing to actually solve the most complex challenges. So it's that two-part thing you have to wind up doing. So that's sort of at the foundation of cognition.
Great. And can you say just a few words about some of these? Yeah, that would be helpful.
So there is a ton of work coming from that model around how do you do things like reduce the working load, the working memory load. How do you reduce cognitive load? Meaning, how do you clear out working memory? So it's things like, don't put too many different weird media elements when things are difficult, because they'll distract working memory, right? So, and there's a whole range of these results that are out there. These are a few that we thought might be some really interesting ones that come from this. So one of this is about scaffolding and sequencing. And again, a lot of this is not like magic. Good teachers have done this for centuries. The point is, it's actually supported by how working memory works from the cognitive science world, that when somebody is not good at something, you got to get them there in steps rather than a big jump, because the big jump will just overload working memory. So you get there in smaller steps. The second piece has to do with reinforcement. Certain kinds of knowledge, especially facts, really benefit from having to retrieve them again, having to see them again, having to come up with them again. And it sounds counterintuitive. The best time to practice a fact is when you're about to forget it. It turns out that gives the optimal reinforcement, is right at the boundary when you're about to forget it, right? And again, this is about how the machine is built. That's not how a computer works. It is how our neural machinery just simply works. And you know, elaborative interrogation, where you're actually retrieving and problem solving, thinking about, describing to somebody else, all of those activities around a concept, an idea, a piece of learning, all of that production reinforces it. So it's not merely a description of it, it also reinforces your own mastery of it as you teach it or describe it and so forth. And then negative stuff that, yeah, you know, when you're under stress, when you're under situations of scarcity that so unfortunately many of our elementary school students and public school students are, you know, the obsession around where am I going to eat, what's happening to my mom, you know, where is my dad, those things take a tax on working memory. And there's actually research on this, that issues of scarcity, they make you learn less. Not because you are not smart, it's because you're taking a toll on working memory. So you don't have as much capacity left over. So you don't look as capable as you really are because of the scarcity, or the stress, or the trauma. Practice and feedback, just really critical that you got to produce. Yeah? You got to do and then get feedback and keep thinking about it and keep working on it. And getting expert feedback gives you that adjustment, gives you the ability to, you know, focus on something new that you might not come up with on your own. Spaced practice, where instead of doing everything all at once, spacing it out over time helps on several dimensions. There's a lot of research about spaced practice for facts, for memorizing just little chunks, but also for writing. It turns out putting a draft of writing away, even overnight, even for 2 days, when you come back to it, your ability to see the errors of what you've written is much enhanced, because you no longer have everything you were thinking about in working memory. It's gone, and so you're kind of relying on the paper, just like your reader will rely on the paper. So again, spacing out the practice and feedback can be really valuable. And then in the research on learning concepts, it turns out when you know, a concept around, let's say you're trying to learn something in physics, in mechanics, problem solving, trying to learn what an energy problem is versus what a momentum problem is, what's really helpful is to see multiple examples, multiple contexts, and then very consciously be drawn to what is the same concept across these very different settings and situations. And it turns out that by looking at the same concept and very explicitly yourself doing the linkage, so it's not about watching the, you know, the discovery video, it's actually you have to do the thinking yourself, and noticing, oh yeah, this looks totally different, but this feature is the same as that feature in that other setting, and those then mean that this is an energy model. That not only helps you solve that problem, but it also reinforces and generalizes the concept. It makes it faster and quicker to recognize what this thing is when you do that kind of practice. And then around personalization, there are several issues here. There is, that's a very kind way of putting it, the first one. The way I would put it is, learning styles are ridiculous, right? That, you know, it is so seductive, right? You know, we have kinesthetic learners, we have auditory learners, we have visual learners. Surely, you know, raise your hand if you're a visual learner. Come on, you know who you are. Yeah, the problem is, when people have done, it seems so intuitive, and it would surely make education so much easier if we could bucket brains into these little, you know, nice, tidy little buckets. The research, people have tried now every 10 to 12 years. People run randomized controlled trials, do a meta-analysis because they're sure this time they've got it, and they discover that when you compare a personalized scheme of learning, where you give a diagnostic and then you give a well-designed piece of specifically to that learning style designed learning, and you compare that to well-designed, it's got to be well-designed, right? Because anything's better than a kick in the head, right? So it's got to be well-designed. Compared to general well-designed learning, there's no difference. So it's so seductive, but no one has come up with a way of categorizing a brain that actually holds true systematically across time, across populations. So Learning styles is not actually helpful at all. But that does not mean that you don't have to have multiple ways of teaching things. That in fact, yeah, if the auditory way doesn't work, have a visual one. If the visual way doesn't work, have a kinesthetic one. I don't know what your catalog of olfactory teaching is, but I'd say get some stink bombs out, because that might be the last resort, right? There's, having multiple ways to teach is valuable. It's just, it won't always be a visual thing for Bror. Today it's visual for this, tomorrow it might be kinesthetic, and the next day it might have to be a piece of text. So the patterns don't actually last. But the thing that definitely does work there are several things that do work on personalization. One is pace. It turns out the research shows giving learners control over the pace of their learning is really valuable. Speeding up, slowing down, all of that. Now what's not up here is the research shows giving novices control over the structure of their learning does not help. It actually holds them back. Because novices don't know what they don't know, so they pick the blue stuff, because they don't know. And I was like, that's not helpful. You need some more expertise for a novice. You got to help the novice to structure what they do first, second, and third, how they actually do it. It turns out, as people get more expert, you actually can and should turn over, what are you doing next? And that last thing, what I distinguish between novices and experts, is maybe the most important thing, that what you have in long-term memory makes a big difference to how you need to be taught. So if you have two students watching an algebra teacher write up ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. One student is looking at it and saying, oh, it's a quadratic equation. She's going to make me factor it. I hate factoring polynomials. My life is over. The other one is thinking, why are there letters and numbers in the same line? Now, they're having an identical sensory experience, but they're having completely different cognitive experiences, because one of them has all that stuff in long-term memory, knows exactly what a quadratic equation is, knows that pattern, and knows that their life is over instantaneously, right? The other one is just mystified. What is this, right? They are not the same animals at all. So by more deeply understanding what is in long-term memory of these learners, and therefore acting to fill the missing parts, that's a part of personalization that really helps. So,
great.
Aylon, fair? Yep.
Yeah. I could listen to you talk about cognition forever.
Oh.
It's one of my favorite things. I'm going to talk just a little bit about racial identity and learning, which is a budding area, right? So unlike some of the cognition studies, this is not something that's been going on for decades and decades. And I should point out, I meant to when we had the Venn diagram, that there's obviously overlap between all of these things, the way cognition works, the way your identity develops, and motivation, as we'll see. For this, I think instead of just giving you some of the research, I'm going to give you one important one. I'm going to give you a vignette of how, which relates to what Bror talked about in terms of working memory. There's a school that we work with called Valor Collegiate in Nashville. And they do some very intentional, I mean, to our mind, it's some of the best quote-unquote SEL community building work that we've seen. And they rely, out of the sort of restorative justice practices on a lot of circle protocols. And I'm going to give you two vignettes. One is a Muslim girl who, after many circle protocols, was ready to sort of tell the story of what it meant. She was maybe 4th or 5th grade, what it meant to be a Muslim in this country. And the kinds of experiences that she had, and the kinds of fears and anxieties that she had. And then the way the circle works is, if someone wants to respond, the student comes to the middle of the circle with you, and you have a conversation. And there was a white girl who said, I don't get it from that angle, but I move around a lot. And so I always feel like I'm new, and I always feel like I'm trying to fit in. And first of all, it was just a beautiful human thing. But in terms of identity development, what's happening there, right, is that first of all, they understand themselves better, right? They understand each other better. And from a working memory perspective, to use Bror's great model, their working memory is now freed up to like work on the task at hand when they go to their lesson, right? Because they're not worried about, they don't have as much anxiety about who am I, how am I seen, etc., right? And it turns out that there's another example like that, but actually I'll give it really quickly. Boy with, who says, I need to bring business to the circle, says, when I build my blocks at recess, some kids come by and knock them down. A couple of kids volunteer to speak and say, we're not going to let that happen, that's wrong. Again, it was this sort of like sense of belonging, like, I'm lesser, this child felt lesser than, almost on a daily basis. And again, because of that kind of thing, their working memory's freed up, right? There's less stress and trauma, right? And their identity develops more deeply for the long term, right? I will cite one piece of research, and then I really want to get into the motivation work. Is anyone familiar with Whistling Vivaldi? A couple people have read that. So I'm not going to do it justice in the 90 seconds that I'll talk about it, but my main goal is to get you to go read it. And so I'll give you the main thesis, which is that stereotype threat, meaning the extent to which your own performance is going to reinforce stereotypes about how members of your group will perform, usually poorly, on said task, has an enormous effect on performance. And just to give you one example of this, they gave a math test to female Asian math majors. So all presumably very good at math, right? To one group before the test, actually one group they just gave the test. The second group, they gave them a little questionnaire before the test that reminded them that they were women. What kind of dorm, do you live in a co-ed dorm, etc., right? Just like, really like, it didn't even seem like it mattered for the test, right? It was just like, personal information kind of thing. So it reminded them they were a woman, then they take a test. Third group, they asked them questions that reminded them that they were Asian. Where did your parents come from? Do you speak a different language at home, etc.? Again, seemed like a throwaway thing. Their performance on that test mirrored exactly the stereotypes you'd expect. The women who took the math test without any pre-questionnaire did worse than the women who were reminded they were Asian, and the women who were reminded they were women did worse than both, right? And so this question of identity development, there's moral and value and happiness things related to this as well that even on their own merits are worth focusing on. But even for learning specifically and performance specifically, this stuff really, really, really matters. And so I'll stop there, and then hopefully that gets you to go get the book and find out more about it. So now let's just take a pause before we go into motivation. And it is important that you actually answer this question for yourself, because we're going to come back to it. Take a moment, whether it was in school or out of school, and think about, when were you wildly motivated to learn? I'm going to have us come back. So did everyone get one? Do you have one in your head? Because the task is, so you're not surprised with the question afterwards, Bror is going to walk us through some of the science on motivation, so that you can apply it to multiple contexts, as we just learned. We'd love for you to be thinking about, as you're listening to the theory, think about your own experience and the extent to which the factors that we name were going on in the time where you were wildly motivated, and then you'll share that. So I just want to preview the question that we'll get to once Bror walks us through.
Great. So motivation, so the way to think about this is we talked a lot about the cognitive dimension. How does expertise work, working memory, long-term memory. The cognitive domain also includes things like sequencing learning. What should you learn earlier? What should you learn later? And so forth and so on. But the other dimension that's really critical for learning, and it's really different, is the motivation dimension. And as you can see here, the definition of motivation for purposes of kind of this research approach is, will you start, persist, and put in mental effort? Starting, persisting, and putting in mental effort. And that's the definition of motivation that a lot of the cognitive psychologists, motivational psychologists, behavioral economists, and others actually use. You'll notice in that definition, will you start, persist, and put in mental effort, the word liking or like does not appear. And this is really important because if you have a well-designed learning activity and you start, persist, and put in mental effort, you will change your brain, right? You don't have to like it. You will change your brain. It's like music practice. It's like the weights. You don't have to love the weights to change your muscles, right? That if you follow a well-designed weight program, hating every second, you will get as strong as if you were some bizarre psychopath who loves the weights. I love the weights. I don't love the weights, I assure you, right? So this, what I'm about to talk to you, is based on a multidisciplinary research scan by one of the world's best cognitive psychologists, Richard Clark, who a couple of years ago looked across a whole range of domains of research, behavioral economics, motivational psychology, social psychology, cognitive psychology, a bunch of others. And there's no better guy to do this work because he spent decades in motivational psychology as well as cognitive psychology. And what he was trying to do, because they all have different languages, they all have different kind of paradigms for how they understand themselves, and he was trying to synthesize out of this, is there some common patterns that emerge from this? And that's what I'm going to present to you. He and I are trying to write this article up now, so hopefully it'll get published in the next few months, and you'll actually have a fat thing with references for it, but trust me, there are many footnotes. And he came out with a model of what are the barriers to starting, persisting, and putting in mental effort that has 4 parts to it. Do you value what you're doing? Do you think you can actually do it? That's the self-efficacy. Do you blame something outside of yourself for why you're not able to start, persist, and put in mental effort? That's the attribution problem. And are you in a negative emotional state? A negative emotional state. So we're going to walk through each of these. And so think a bit about your own circumstance when you felt the most engaged with learning. Which of these, or all of these, were part of the fuel for you? Which of these really got you going? So next, you have the, oh, sorry, great, sorry. So the first one is valuing. Do you value what you're doing? So, imagine if you've got 2 dancers in that algebra class I was talking about before, okay? So one of those dancers is sitting there and looking up at that ax squared plus bx plus c thing and is thinking to himself, well, I don't care about this. I'm thinking about my role in Swan Lake. I got to lift this ballerina, and I don't want to. I got no interest, right? So they don't start. They don't persist. He doesn't put in mental effort. So how do you help somebody like that? What's the treatment for that? Well, the treatment for that is to try to figure out how do you connect this work in algebra to something that is of interest to an artist or a dancer. And so that could be something about dance foundations and how do you get enough money for dance foundations? How do you invest? How do you know you're not going to run out of money? There's math involved with that. And so there's a way to create some interest around, well, okay, I guess I got to think about this. And there's other ways to do it too, but you want to create an interest like that. Okay, and so back up for 1 second, right? So that's one kind of motivation is around just connecting to an interest. But there's a couple of others in here too. It's, for example, if you're an expert in something, simply using your expertise is pleasurable. It's great. And this is where the liking part comes in, right? If you like to use your expertise, or even you don't know why you're doing it, and it frankly isn't anything you're good at, but the activity itself is just kind of fun, well, that's value. So liking comes into the value side. Liking can be a part of the power that you're doing. And of course, if you miss all those things, tough, then you're not going to do it. Next. So the second dancer in that algebra class, right, is sitting there, and he's thinking, I'm no good at math. I've never been good at math. And so this is going to be a disaster, as usual for me. Now, if you go rushing up to that dancer and they're saying, it's so important for your future when you want to run a dance foundation, this is how you don't run out of money, right? He's sitting there thinking, yeah, I know, my life is over. I get this, because I'm never going to be able to do this, right? It's the wrong treatment, right? It's a different motivation problem. The correct treatment for this, from research about how you handle these kinds of issues of self-efficacy, involves refusing to acknowledge that they can't do it and backing up, problem solving. Where is the gap here? There's something that's missing. You can do this. We just have to back up enough to find out what's missing in long-term memory and how do we practice that and get that going. Make a plan and basically convince the learner that with more effort, you can do this. It's in your control, right? When you say, I can't do math, you're basically saying, I'm not in control. And the idea is, yes, you can back up and do more practice. Here's a plan. We can actually get there, right? So that's the second problem, is a self-efficacy problem when I just can't do it. Next one is attribution problems. So it's a little bit like the second one, but now instead of I can't do math, I blame something in my environment. So my teacher hates me. Or have you seen this textbook? Who could read this textbook? Or, this is a great one, I just don't have enough time. Right? I could do the work, but I don't have enough time, and therefore I don't start, persist, and put in mental effort. Right? And so, you know, and other things along those lines. And again, that's very different than the first two, because now I'm blaming something outside of me. And again, the intervention is problem solving around what did you say was the problem, right? So if you said the problem was, I don't have enough time, let's look at your schedule together. Let's figure out, where are you spending your time? Or, I don't have a place to study. Well, let's see, where do you go? Maybe we can find a place for you, somewhere where you go that you can actually study, and so forth. So it's very problem solving around that specific piece, in part to communicate, this is in your control. It's not the case that it's out of your control. You can problem solve around it, and I am here to help you. There's a strategy, more effort, we can get it solved. Last one, this is the hardest one. These are negative emotional states. If you are angry or scared or depressed, you're not going to start, persist, and put in mental effort. It's just really difficult to do that. And so it is as difficult to solve these things as you can imagine. I mean, this is where social psychology and social services, all kinds of things, may need to be wheeled up to help. But again, it's really different than the other three, right? That it's a very specific set of things that can be tackled, and that is, and you may have more than one of these, but it needs to be tackled separately, right? So the cool thing about this framework that Dick Clark came up with is it helps with this issue of not labeling students as just lumps. You know, that Bror, he's just lazy. I don't know, he just doesn't engage. You know, some kids are like Bror. Actually, thank heavens they're not, but I mean, some kids are like Bror, right? And so instead, no, that's not good enough. That's like saying, you know, yeah, Aylon, yeah, he's just sick. Some people are sick. I don't know. I hope he gets better. Well, that's ridiculous. It's like, well, wait, why is Aylon sick? What's going on with Aylon? Is it a cold or a flu or something else, right? So the same thing here, there's a framework to say, no, Bror is not just a lump. Why is Bror behaving like a lump? Is it one of these four things or several of them? Each of them has things you can go after. So now it's not enough to just say, he's a lump. You have to do something about it, right? So that's kind of the key thing around motivation is, you know, those four things. And the positive side is really powerful. Do you value what you're doing? Do you think you can get at it? Do you feel like, I'm good, I got the resources and I can do this, I know what I need to do? And are you in a positive frame of mind? That can really fuel what's going on. So when you think about when you are most excited about learning, think about what are those pieces that are in there. So.
Great, thanks. And so that's really the setup for this. So back to that question of when were you wildly motivated to learn, just take a moment to process this with your partner now that they know a little bit about that story. What was going on? What made you start, persist, and put in mental effort in wildly engaging ways? So just wrestle with the framework a little bit through your own research. Sorry to cut you off on the where research meets me search. I'd love to now apply this to learning environments. Given the size of the groups, you might be able to do more than one. But the first question, before we think about how we might prototype and engineer some of these solutions, we'd love you to just do a rapid brainstorm, right? So you have pens there, and chart paper. You just like write all over it. Pick one of these, right? One of the 4 areas, and just go nuts with in a typical school environment. You can pick the school you went to, or your school you work at, or a school your kid goes to. Pick whatever environment is going to be your representative environment, and just think if my only goal was to optimize this factor, right? To stop doing any of the barrier stuff and only do the stuff that gets kids to persist and apply real mental effort. What would you start doing immediately, and what would you stop doing immediately, right? So the point here is to be as generative as possible on the things that typically happen in schools and classrooms that either are barriers to this particular area of motivation or are enablers. To start doing things that are enablers. Does the task make sense?
So the goal, it's sort of an extreme sports idea. It's an unrealistic design exercise,
yes.
Which is fine. But the point is to just sort of spit out some ideas that would be the extreme version of this, of one of these. So pick one of these and say, if it's going to be all about that, let's do that.
Oh, right. And of course, I forgot about the handouts. Thank you, Rob. What you may want to start with is we added just a few more details to these 4 areas and you can join a table or do it on your own, whatever you want to do, to maybe give you what this adds to the descriptions that Bror had are just some like, here's what it sounds like when this particular thing is being driven. Here's what it sounds like when there's the barrier. And hopefully that will both deepen your understanding, but also spark some of the extreme design that we're describing, where you can think of things you'd stop and start doing immediately if your sole task in life was to maximize that motivation factor.
Mm-hmm. Great. And how much time, Aylon?
We will have. I need to look at the time. Sorry. You will have 8 minutes, and then I'll check in with you to see where you're at. And depending on your energy, we might go for another 5. Ready? Yes. Check for understanding. You pick one.
Just one.
Just
Each table
pick
picks one.
Yep. Literally pick one. 8 minutes on one that you pick.
Just
ready?
One.
Go. I stop you at the risk of affecting your mood, which might affect your motivation. But it seems, walking around, it seems like folks have generated some starts and stops. Right now, these are ideas, right, that are derived from the science. And the question is, how do you turn those ideas into things that people can use, test the extent to which those things work, and then ensure people use it so that kids learn more and are more motivated, right? And so we want to introduce now a second layer, which is the layer of learning engineering. And then take some of these ideas and think about how we're going to prototype them. Now, fair warning, at the end of this, after this next piece that Bror is going to talk about, and then the exercise, we're going to have some question-answer session. However, the ticket to answering a question will be that you offer something to the group in terms of an insight and or a prototype that you're going to do. So start thinking about both your questions and the offerings that you might make the group.
So we talked a bunch about the science of what's going on. You've been brainstorming a bit about possible ways to use the science. But we have to acknowledge science is not the same as engineering, much to the frustration of scientists, right? That there's nothing more irritating to a scientist than a real problem. I asked one of the world's most cited learning scientists, Richard Mayer, if he would help us design an algebra course, and he backed away screaming. because he said, I don't know anything about building math courses. And I said, but you're like the world's most accomplished person in understanding how media and text actually go together. And he said, yeah, but that doesn't mean I know anything about building a course. So there is this distinction between the science and the engineering that's really important to understand. So science, very correctly, is done under really controlled conditions, varying one thing at a time, and is very focused on reinforcing or breaking down a theory and building out new models of what is going on under the hood, right? Incredibly important work. It's also, very narrowly, derived and conceived and tested. So it provides fuel to real-world situations, but boy, it's really different than that. So learning engineering is about applying, any engineering is about applying one or many sciences in the wild. You have a real problem, real issues, real constraints. How can you use how the world actually works to help you solve that as best you can within those constraints, trying to get the most important things right, and acknowledging, hey, not everything is going to go perfectly, right? So there are many things altering at once, right? Scientists hate that. I remember when we were first doing some learning engineering work at Kaplan, and we wanted to demonstrate to my business colleagues that using learning science was really valuable. We threw the cognitive and motivational science kitchen sink at a whole set of virtual education courses. And our science colleagues were shocked and appalled because we were doing like 20 things at once. And they said, you won't know what worked. And I said, yeah, but it better work. Whatever it is, that's what we're after. And it did work. And the scientist said, yeah, you don't know why? And I said, yeah, well, then we can figure that out now. But we actually got it to work in the wild with thousands of students, which then drove our other colleagues to say, can we do this some more? Right? So solving the problem in the wild within the constraints, even if you don't answer a theory question, is part of the engineering side. And as it says there at the end, you're really trying to build stuff. So you're still measuring, and you're still doing potentially pilots, even randomized controlled trial pilots, if you can get away with it, if you can figure out how to do it. But the goal is not publication. The goal is to demonstrate, is it working and how well? One of the just realities of the move from a laboratory into the field in medicine, in chemistry, in material science, everywhere, is everything works less well in the real world. I wish it weren't the case. It's just the truth. So the goal is to start from something that works really, really well in the lab. So in the education work, if you can find something that in controlled conditions gets you a full standard deviation of effect on the little freshman laboratory rats that they use all the time out of cognitive psychology courses, that's a good starting point. Because you're going to lose a bunch of that effect as you work in the real world, but you're starting from a whole standard deviation of impact, right? So that's the way to think about this is start with stuff that has some good effects in the sciences, and then you bring it to the wild. You may have to do many things at once, but your goal is to make an actual environment or a product that really works with the learners, and then to measure that you're making progress. That's learning engineering. Next. And, a couple more things about how to think about this. When you're putting things to work and you want to pilot stuff, of course you want to celebrate success. But good engineers are always thinking of the fault trees. How could this go wrong? And trying to instrument what is happening so that you'll have some evidence when it probably does go wrong. So instead of just, it didn't work, you can wind up saying something about, well, it looks like the training got through to the teachers. The teachers attended the training. The teachers appeared in their final demonstrations to understand what they'd been trained on. It looks like most of the teachers actually were doing that in the classroom. See all the links in that chain, right? Any of those links could be broken, and it wouldn't work. But if the teachers never attended the training, that's a really different problem than the technique is delivered as designed at the right dosage to the right students, and it doesn't work. Those are completely different reasons for why it doesn't work, with very different next steps for trying to solve it, right? So you want to instrument for failure, and it's really depressing, and nobody likes to imagine I'm going to fail, right? This is a thought exercise that has some heartache to it, because everyone is hopeful that it will work, but it's actually the engineering analog of the scientific mindset, which seeks to disprove a hypothesis. I design experiments to destroy my best idea, right? This is the engineering analog, where I'm instrumenting for failure. If it fails, what will I have learned, right? And the second thing is, it turns out you can often think better once you've built something in the wild. It helps you prioritize. It helps you realize, well, that went well, but this, whoa, that's not going well. It helps you focus your thinking. If you sit in an armchair and just keep trying to imagine what it will be like, you may spin a lot of mental cycles and not actually discover some of the most important things. So your thinking in the wild as a learning engineer is actually helped by building and testing more rapidly rather than just sitting around. It's like agile development in software. Get it out there, get the data, fail, but instrument to do it. And then finally, all this is related, iterating and tinkering, but with your users. Get them involved in it. Show them what you're trying to do. And then you're also, tinkering on their behalf. You're trying new things to help make it work. So this is all part of this engineering mindset.
Okay, so now's your chance to try to put this on. And of course, these are very controlled and artificial conditions. But the goal here would be take one of your ideas, probably one of your start ideas, although it could be a stop. Because stopping actually may require doing something to stop. There might be a different kind of training or a different kind of incentive system or all kinds of things, right? So really you could pick one, either of the stop or the start. And think about how you would actually construct your first prototype. What would you go do? What kinds of assumptions would you be trying to test? How would you instrument for failure, right? So how would you be thinking about the assumptions that you're testing in that chain for whatever the product is that you're trying to build and iterate on? You're not, obviously, you're not going to get at the level of fidelity of something you'll go roll out tomorrow. In fact, I'm only giving you 11 minutes to do it. But in 11 minutes, we just want you to get a little bit of practice. And I'll say one last thing, which is, this process has some similarity to some of the practices that we have around, data-driven instruction or regular, professional development, where we look at a teacher action and sort of see, well, that students didn't get that, so they should take this action, so we'll coach them towards that. There are some parallels here. One of the big differences, though, is the product orientation of it. So oftentimes, when we're thinking in more what is now traditional data-driven instruction and teacher coaching type of environments, we're doing the logic chain, right? But it's about the execution of something that's already been designed, right? It's how we execute that lesson plan or how we master that standard, et cetera. It's pulling implementation levers almost exclusively. Whereas here, what we love you to push into, how would I design the thing? What is the thing, what would the experience be? And be open to the idea that you would actually iterate and prototype the experience itself, not just the levers of implementation. Does that make sense? Okay. First, I just want to commend you all on really building some stuff. And hopefully this is a welcome change from being passively listening to people talk about things and trip over screens. But so we'd love to just open up the space really to do two things. As I said, one, give an offering to the group. What did you prototype? What insight? What aha have you had? And then secondly, are there any questions for me, for Bror, for the group, or even just questions that you don't want to answer to, but is something that's lingering for you? So we can use the space as we'd like. Yeah, I'll open up the floor. They're going to finish up their prototype back there.
Ooh, give us an offering. Who
Yeah.
wishes to give an offering?
All right, I'll start us off over here.
Great.
So our initial conversation, we talked a lot about, we started.
Oh, nice.
Well done. Thanks, DeAndre.
All right. So our initial conversation, we talked a lot around value as the motivation, and really we're talking about relevant, project-based, hands-on experiences for students where they're able to understand, get the why, and then as opposed to the sit and get, teacher as this expert and instiller of knowledge onto students. And so then that led us into this conversation when we started moving into prototyping about really thinking about the teacher and who the teacher is, and that the teacher needs to experience these deeply meaningful learning experiences themselves to be able to then translate that to students and be able to provide those as well. So we sort of flipped the paradigm because we had talked about orientation shifts, that these really hard to get at, those mindsets, beliefs, and what teachers are coming with, that we really need to teach teachers as learners. So rather than getting away or trying to get away from, pre-service and then they go into this experience and they're coached instructionally, let's back up and think about how we can provide teachers experiences that are relevant, meaningful, purposeful, and help them to then better be able to design learning experiences like that for students. And we went a little bit deeper and talked about personalization of that for teachers. So providing teachers then more personalized pathways, and getting a better understanding if they're coming in, is that either talked about skill, will, and knowledge gaps, and they're very different things, and that would provide a very different pathway. Technical, adaptive, exposure, like what type of issue are we dealing with here? And then teachers would have experiences built for them or designed that they would they would actually have active agency and role in participating in throughout their teaching career.
Yeah.
And so that was basically, did I miss anything, guys?
Yeah, that's awesome.
Very cool, very cool.
Yeah, and you actually spanned 3 motivation factors there, from value to self-efficacy to I'm in control, and that's fantastic.
Who else? Offerings. Here we go. Here we got an offering. Yes. Thank you, sir. Ooh, here we go.
So we also did the value one as well. And so one of the things that we focused in on was having students solve real world problems. And so our prototype essentially has up to 99 problems, which can be generated by all of the different stakeholders, so students, parents, community, companies, so they all can generate these problems. But essentially, all of the stakeholders would go in and rate these problems based off of what they're most interested in. And so they'll rate them on the scale. And then it will give back their rating. So they'll pick like their #1 choice. So say it was climate change, which was problem number 17. And then they will generate other students that also rated this as their #1 problem, other teachers, companies, and then share the names of people in the companies, their career path. And then based off of this network of people, students would then have the ability to learn together and then hopefully create a plan for action.
Very cool. Very cool.
There must be an offering in this table.
There must be an offering.
We chose mood, and we had a whole bunch. We had a big list of different starts and stops for the mood thing, but we picked 2 things to sort of combine. We saw that in a lot of places, kids checking in with adults daily or very consistently is really helpful, so they can adjust what their expectations are based on their mood. But we also suggested that kids talking to each other would be really cool too, because they might, if you can solve what you're going through talking to whoever, it doesn't, whoever you talk to can change. But we thought some environments have really tight schedules and not much time to do this. So we created this mood check-in rotation where kids would talk to each other 2 by 2. The teacher would be in a rotation too, talking with a kid. They would talk for a few minutes. They would rotate. You could probably only get to 2 or 3 conversations, but we'd have one time every day for this to happen so that each kid can talk to every other kid. Each teacher can talk to the students once or twice a week. And then so we kind of designed what that would look like. We said that there's probably some outcome we need to have. So like after, as a student, if I talk to 2 or 3 people, then I kind of self-evaluate with like a hashtag or something that we can like, what am I feeling? What am I going through? We also said that we've got to work really hard on what the weekly themes and questions should be. There should probably be some open-ended time where kids are talking about what they're going through or what they're feeling, but you could also use this opportunity to have them speak about and discuss specific things. And then sort of like the outcome, we have a student, crisscross applesauce, doing yoga. That means they're calm and they're ready to go about their day. But then I think for the most of the time, we talked about, I think, 2 groups of things here. One is things that we'd have to test to see like where is it going to fall apart, and the other group of things is like things we identified where we might have to re-engineer what we thought because we already know that something might fall apart, as we discussed. And then we thought maybe we should use surveys to figure it out. We came up with a couple measurements that we could do. And then at the very end, we thought that if we bring this to a more social emotional, like this so far is like for every student to succeed, what would they need? But if you wanted it to be more of a group discussion to go through and work on something as a group, then you could adjust this a little bit and do a group debrief at the end. And then we also thought about if we find things that make this fall apart, what can we do with the whole group to improve it? So having 1 week where we work on listening. And so, you know, you're still trying to make this work, but you have to like throw in little mini lessons and practice skills that will make kids successful. So they're not just like making things up or lying or, you know. So did I miss anything?
Cool.
Very
Nice
cool.
prototype.
Very cool. Right there, back there. Yep, great. That's really great. Thank you.
Other offerings and or questions? Anything from the back table?
Yeah, we had a very robust conversation off topic about
Yeah.
mastering adaptive systems. So
Yeah. Awesome.
How
Great.
about those Mets? How about those Mets? I have a question. I have a question for you guys, and I think you answered it right at the end, which was, in order for that rotating group thing with very different kids to work, I think you said this at the end, but you might want to put it towards the beginning, is you got to help them get ready to talk to people they might not even play on the playground with, right? Or go have a beer with, but you're doing K through 12, right? Yeah, okay, sorry. So I was trying to do the equivalent, the moral equivalent of getting a beer with. I think it's playing on the playground, right? Something like that. Anyway, all right, fine. And it's such a useful skill. And it's so important to recognize how to do that. You know, so much of teamwork out in the real world involves working with very diverse teams. That's how you get the best thing. So getting the little people started doing that is really powerful. But you may need some scaffolding to do that. I don't know if that's a little role play thing or if it's just some first efforts or what it looks like, but that might be a good way to get it started. But you mentioned it at the end, so it sounds like you guys were thinking about that as one of the failure modes. So.
We figured that out.
Oh, sorry, wait.
We
Thank you, sir.
figured that we needed more structure. So there are these little boxes that were added. But I think what that kind of shows is that this might be an actual, like almost like a curriculum of skills that we can work on.
Yep.
And I would say just for the meta experience of that too, like we actually put that as you teach the like in terms of the student prototype, it went back to the beginning. We didn't identify it until we did the pressure testing to say where is this going to fall apart,
Right.
and that's when it got uncovered. Like, oh, you actually need prerequisite skills to even launch into the journey.
Yep.
So I think the sketch and then the trying to actually pull it apart was how we came to that.
Yep. But all of these you guys have experienced. That is the sort of the essence of the engineering thing, is that you start with a simple idea and then you try to simulate it. You try to walk through it to see what is going to go wrong. I mean, as you were thinking about the 100 problems over there, starting to think about, okay, so how would that work? And what if we didn't get enough problems? Or what if, somebody's left out? I mean, there's a bunch of things you can start to think through what could happen, as opposed to what could possibly go wrong. You're doing the opposite. How many ways could this go wrong, right? And it lets you then come up with new insights about how to make this work better too. So that's cool.
Productive paranoia.
Yes, productive paranoia.
A learning engineer's friend.
Yes, exactly. Yes. That's a good way to look at it. Questions, thoughts about this? How impossible does this seem to you guys as something to actually take back or use in your own lives? Is there anyone here who's actually used this in their own lives already? Craig?
So I guess the question is, how have I used this in my own life? I think in my instructional life, really it's been an iterative process of considering the student experience in my own classrooms in the ways that you've outlined and the domains that you've talked about. And then in a broader sense, when we think about teacher or faculty communities adopting whatever the type of intervention approach is that we have, thinking about their motivations as well along these domains is very important to driving this kind of work in the settings and institutions that we work in.
Who else has tried something iterative like this or has other comments? Who else? Go ahead. Wait. The runner.
So I can reflect on my current role, but previously I was with San Francisco Unified School District, and we launched an iLab, an innovation lab, in-house lab. We had a physical space, but was more so, it was kind of like an innovation infrastructure within a school district. Really fascinating work, a lot of learnings there, but taking groups of educators and mixed groups of educators involving some central office folks and whatnot through a design process, so a facilitated design process where they'd submit a proposal and we'd do this 6-week process with them, which was amazing. We worked with the D School, we worked with the Stanford D School, worked with IDEO. It was a really fun process, but I found the empathy work we did with them and the end user interviews to be, I think, the most, if I had to say like one key takeaway of something we can do really easy with teachers is just have them shadow kids, have them talk to students, have them experience like whatever they're trying to do. Like often we over-engineer things. You create this like perfect project or lesson plan, but you have zero idea or about what are the motivations of students you're actually designing for. So I just think that the value in having, whoever it is, central office folk or whoever, also understand those that you're designing for is just wildly valuable.
Yep.
And not a hard lift.
Yep. Other thoughts or comments? Gentlemen here.
Hi, my name's Brad. I work at Fur High School. It's in Houston. And one thing we did this year is we implemented a Genius time slot for kids to go and discover things that they're interested in, their passions. And so we have a flexible scheduling software that we use, Google, but we also have another one. And so kids would schedule in and we re-engineered our entire school schedule so there would be 2 blocks of hour and a half Tuesday and Thursday, where kids essentially, like Google's 20% time, they get to work on whatever it is they want. That's, at first it was taught and inspired by teachers, but then we had students teaching things. Somebody's doing Taekwondo, so several kids sign up for that. And then we have a garden, and so several kids. And then we have Zumba. We have about 60 kids in Zumba, and now kids are certified teaching that themselves. So it's been real exciting, kind of a generative process like this, and it goes with the value piece. Of course, it starts with there, but it really hits on almost all these pieces when you start doing these things.
Yep. Other comments, thoughts, questions?
Or questions?
One, did you have one? Yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning that a lot of cognitive science doesn't make it into education or teaching or curriculum. And I was thinking, like, where does it make it into? And the only thing I could think of was maybe like product marketing, where where is
Journals.
it used?
Journals. Published dusty tomes stacked up in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, accessible by tractor trailers. It takes usually a day to get it out. So it's actually not quite that bad. But yeah, it does get stuck. Now, there are some good syntheses around that are actually even worth looking at if you guys know people who design learning or you yourselves are designing learning. There's things like E-Learning and the Science of Instruction, which is by Ruth Clark and Richard Mayer, the Mayer I described before. They're now in their 4th edition. They've repeatedly synthesized a whole range of cognitive architecture, mostly, work into a guide for instructional design. It's really good. There's also, of course, the work of Carol Dweck. She's done some popularized things. There's Daniel Willingham's work, Why Don't Students Like School? That's an excellent way of looking for insights. There's Hattie and Yates, John Hattie and somebody Yates, Visible Learning, The Science of Learning Applied, or something like that. That one has actually quite a bit about motivation, so it's actually another good source. So there's a bunch of these syntheses out there that are available. It's just not yet part of the culture to draw on them, right? And so that's what we need. And there are a variety of resources and organizations, like Transcend Education, like the Rapid Cycle Evaluation Group out of the Department of Education and the work they're trying to do to encourage people to think iteratively and systematically. And there are some more efforts around. The D-School has been doing a bunch of things on this front. And so there's a range of these initiatives. But the trick is everybody needs to start looking for those and trying them. One last thing I might say.
I'm going to add one thing to that before you say
good,
the next thing, which is part of the reason, at least in our analysis, why everything that Bror just said is true, is that we spend 0.25% of all the money we spend in education on R&D. And in healthcare and other sectors, it can be as much as 50, 20, even 25%. So, we have the National Institutes of Health at the federal level that spends $30 billion a year trying to come up with actual things that people can use. Pharmaceutical companies, they're coming up with prototypes and testing new drugs, et cetera, et cetera. There's no equivalent of that, right? So the health science, right, has a place to go to get to be applied. But education currently does not have that kind of clearinghouse. And so that's part of the reason we started Transcend, but is also something we think it needs to be way beyond just what Transcend does. That is a sector-wide way of taking these insights and others' insights and other inputs like the ones we started with, shadowing students, et cetera, future trends, and turning it into things that work for people.
One last thing I'd suggest as an innovation, as a piece to think about is, why shouldn't we teach kids how learning works? They get to own their brains for the rest of their lives. I mean, I'm looking for a trade-in, but I mean, our kids, they're going to have to own their brains for the rest of their lives, right? So why shouldn't they have a user manual for their own minds instead of a mythology about learning? Like, if this is hard, I shouldn't be doing it because I'm no good at it. Lots of kids have that as their theory of learning, that if it's hard for me, I must be doing it wrong, right? Well, we should make them all into their own little learning engineers, at least for their own learning, and not make this a secret. And then all of the learning environments that are designed this way, we can explain to the kids, too, how this matches and reinforces what we told you about your own learning. And then, frankly, they will help you redesign your learning environments because they are learning engineers, too, at that point. So it's a piece to think about. So
love that. That's great.
Yes, one more minute. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, wait, if we have a microphone, maybe. Hang on. The sprint. Here he is.
One thing I would add to that is I think that one way we can do that as educators is actually in what we would term study skills for our students. So there's great work that I can pass to you and to spread to the group. But basically, it's termed in research as metacognitive planning, performance, and evaluation of performance. And so our learners can become more effective by thinking about how they're studying in preparing for learning and actually executing learning, and then improve that iteratively over time.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
That's great.
Aylon?
What a great note to end on, that all our little ones will be learning engineers themselves. But thank you. Thank you for being part of an interactive and participatory session. We sort of took a chance and made it not just talky all the time, and it feels like it worked. So, and it wouldn't have worked without you. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, guys.